Empty!
Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world, one book at a time.
All right, so today we're diving into a system that's so fundamental, so baked into how we organize our world, that most of the time we don't even see it as a system. I'm talking about citizenship. We're going to peel back the layers and see how it really operates as this incredibly powerful gatekeeper, the thing that decides who's in and who's out in a democracy.
And for this, we're leaning on the work in The Condition of Democracy, Volume 2. What this book really digs into is how democracies, especially when they feel the pressure of migration, do something more than just, have borders. They actively build and police these really complex boundaries of who belongs. And the key thing to notice, it's how those boundaries get more and more securitized, and almost always more exclusionary.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this, we need to make one simple but really powerful shift in how we think about the whole thing. It's a new way to see the system. We usually think about citizenship as an identity, right? It's about who we are, where we're from. But the book makes a really strong case that we should see it first and foremost as a legal status. And look at the key phrase right there. It regulates access. It's basically an access control system.
And that right there brings us to the main idea for this whole explainer. I want you to think about citizenship not just as a passport, but as an access badge. Like the kind you use at work. A badge that literally determines what you have access to, which rights, which protections, which resources, and maybe even more importantly, what you're locked out of. So if we're running with this idea of citizenship as an access badge, what happens when a whole lot of people show up at the door wanting one? Well, it turns out the system responds in some pretty predictable ways. So the big question is, how does this access badge system actually work when it's put under pressure, say during what gets called a refugee crisis? Turns out we can spot 4 key patterns that keep showing up.
Okay, pattern number 1, crisis framing. The very first thing that happens is the state labels the situation a crisis. And this isn't just talk, it's a very real political tool. The second you declare a crisis, you create this feeling of emergency, which conveniently gives you the justification you need to change the rules of the game.
Check out this quote from the book. It says, "To produce the authority to declare a situation to be a crisis is to acquire the legitimacy to bypass the democratic processes." Think about that. If you can frame the crisis, you give yourself permission to just sidestep the usual democratic rules. It's a massive shortcut to power. So once you're in crisis mode, what's next? Well, that's pattern 2, creating new status categories. This is where it gets really granular. All of a sudden, it's not just a simple binary of citizen and non-citizen. Nope. The system starts inventing this whole ladder of different statuses, and each rung on that ladder comes with a completely different set of rights. This is where you start hearing terms like asylum seeker or refugee used in very specific ways. The rights that come with those labels, they become super conditional, and often they're heavily restricted. Things like access to healthcare, or the right to work, or even getting an education. Those aren't givens anymore. They become these tightly controlled variables. Your access badge basically gets a whole bunch of permissions revoked. Okay, so now you've got all these new boundaries, all these new categories of people. What do you need next? You need someone to police it all, right? And that leads us straight to the third pattern, a huge, massive growth in enforcement. This example from Turkey is a perfect and pretty stark illustration of this. A security package gets approved that gives police way more power, way more freedom to just stop, search, and detain people. And you can see how this becomes a cycle, right? The more you treat the border like a security problem, the more enforcement you need. And the more enforcement you have, the more it justifies treating the border like a security problem. It just feeds on itself.
But here's the thing. This system isn't just a top-down, one-way street. The people caught up in it, they aren't just passive. And that brings us to our fourth and final pattern, what the book calls claims making. This is all about how migrants and refugees actively push back and challenge the system.
And this is a really fascinating idea. When migrants take part in protests, or look for work, or enroll their kids in local schools, or demand legal rights, they are, for all intents and purposes, acting like citizens, even if they don't have the official paperwork. They're creating a kind of on-the-ground de facto membership, and that puts real pressure on the system, challenging the very lines it's trying so hard to draw.
All right, so let's zoom out. When you put all these pieces together, the crisis framing, the new categories, the beefed-up enforcement, and the pushback from below, what does all of this really tell us about democracy itself?
And that's really the final, most important question here. What's the deep truth that this whole access badge system shows us about how our societies work? Here it is, the big takeaway. We tend to think of democracy as voting, right? Elections, participation. But what this way of looking at things shows us is that on a much deeper level, democracy is first about defining who the people even are. It's about this constant, and yeah, often brutal fight over who gets to be a full member of the club and how that line between us and them is drawn and policed.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a longer audio-based analysis of this topic, see the deep dive linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.